In America, we love to believe that we've moved past our ugly history of racial discrimination. We proclaim our society fair and equal, pointing to laws against segregation as proof of progress. Yet racism hasn't disappeared. It has merely evolved into more subtle, insidious forms. Nowhere is this more evident than in the supposedly civilized spaces of air travel, where black passengers find themselves constantly having to justify their presence, particularly in premium cabins. The following incident reveals how quickly the veneer of civility drops when black excellence dares to occupy spaces traditionally reserved for white privilege. As Morgan approached, Veronica's welcoming tone subtly shifted. "Welcome aboard," she said curtly, the warmth noticeably absent. Behind Morgan, Mr. and Mrs. Whitman, a couple in their 60s, settled into their seats. Mrs. Whitman clutched a small knitting bag, her fingers already twitching to begin her work, while Mr. Whitman held a folded newspaper, his expression one of mild curiosity as he took in the scene. Veronica's smile brightened instantly for them. "Good morning, Mr. and Mrs. Whitman. Lovely to have you with us again." Morgan glanced over her shoulder, noting the stark contrast in Veronica's tone. Her expression remained calm, though her eyes reflected an awareness of the unspoken dynamics at play. As the other passengers settled, Veronica moved through the cabin, ensuring everything was in place. She checked on the Whitmans, offering them another warm smile. "Is there anything I can get for you before we take off?" Mrs. Whitman shook her head politely, already absorbed in her knitting. Mr. Whitman nodded toward his coffee, indicating his satisfaction. But when Veronica passed Morgan, her demeanor shifted again. She glanced at Morgan's bag resting neatly under the seat, her lips pressing into a thin line. She offered no courtesy, no acknowledgement, just walked by without a word. Veronica Reed, in her early 40s, carried herself with the precision of someone who thrived on control. Her pristine uniform and perfectly coiffed hair matched her sharp demeanor. To Veronica, appearances mattered more than anything, and her judgments were swift and unapologetic. Her eyes narrowed as she watched Morgan settle in. Something about Morgan didn't sit right with her. Not her clothes, not her quiet self-assurance, not the fact that she didn't immediately seek attention like many of the passengers Veronica deemed worthy of respect. In Veronica's mind, Morgan simply didn't belong. With quick, purposeful strides, she approached Morgan, her lips curling into a tight smile. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said, her tone polite but dripping with condescension. "I think you're in the wrong section." Morgan glanced up, her expression calm. "I believe this is my seat," she replied, her voice steady. Veronica's smile didn't waver, but her tone sharpened. "I don't think so. This section is reserved for our elite passengers." Nearby, other passengers began to notice the exchange. A nosy socialite leaned slightly to get a better view, her curiosity piqued. A friendly businessman across the aisle frowned slightly at Veronica's tone. Morgan remained composed, her gaze unwavering. "You might want to double-check your passenger list before making assumptions." Veronica's eyebrows arched, her irritation barely hidden. "I don't need to check anything," she said sharply. "I know who belongs here and who doesn't." Tension thickened in the cabin. Passengers exchanged glances, whispering quietly. Others, uncomfortable, pretended not to notice. One passenger muttered, "Why doesn't she just move if she's in the wrong seat? She's probably trying to sneak in for a free upgrade." Another whispered, loud enough to be heard. Veronica crossed her arms, standing her ground. "If you don't move to the back of the plane," she said, her voice loud enough for others to hear, "I'll have to call security." Morgan tilted her head slightly, her expression unwavering. "Call whoever you need to," she said. "But I'm not moving." The nosy socialite gasped softly. The businessman leaned forward, his brow furrowed. Veronica, now visibly frustrated, turned to the junior flight attendant, Naomi, who stood nearby watching nervously. "Naomi," Veronica snapped, "escort her to the back, now!" Naomi hesitated, glancing between Morgan and Veronica. She wanted to speak up, to say something about checking the passenger list as Morgan had suggested, but Veronica's sharp glare froze her in place. Reluctantly, she nodded and stepped forward. Morgan shifted slightly in her seat, her calm demeanor still intact. "You might want to think carefully about what you're doing," she said softly, her words carrying more weight than Veronica realized. Veronica scoffed, waving off the warning. "I know exactly what I'm doing," she said. "Now get up." Veronica's tone grew sharper as she gestured toward the back of the plane. "You're not supposed to be here," she said again, her voice now tinged with impatience. The passengers watched in stunned silence, the tension crackling in the air like static. Morgan leaned back slightly, her gaze steady on Veronica. "You shouldn't make assumptions about people," she said quietly. Veronica's smirk widened. "And you shouldn't be in a seat you didn't pay for." The confrontation escalated as Morgan finally picked up her phone, her calm expression unchanging. She typed something quickly, then set it back down on the armrest. "You're making a mistake," she said simply, her words hanging in the air. Veronica didn't listen. "We'll see about that," she muttered, gesturing again for Naomi to act. The junior attendant stepped closer, her hesitation palpable as the scene continued to unfold. Veronica's irritation only grew as Morgan remained seated, her quiet confidence a stark contrast to Veronica's increasingly flustered demeanor. The tension in the cabin thickened with every passing moment, drawing the attention of nearby passengers who watched the exchange with curiosity and disbelief. Veronica's voice rose loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'm going to ask you one last time. Move to the back of the plane, or I will call security." Her words carried a sharp edge, her tone dripping with condescension. Morgan, calm as ever, looked up at Veronica. "I've already told you I'm not moving," she said simply. Her tone was even, almost soothing, but it held an undeniable strength that only infuriated Veronica further. A woman ahead, a nosy socialite with perfectly coiffed hair and an air of entitlement, leaned toward her companion. She whispered loudly enough for others to hear. "Looks like she's trying to sneak in for a free ride." Veronica seized on the comment, her smirk returning. "That's exactly what it looks like," she said, folding her arms and turning to the other passengers as if rallying support. "We have rules for a reason. Some people just don't respect them." Morgan didn't respond to the insults or the growing murmurs around her. Instead, she kept her gaze steady on Veronica, her composure a quiet defiance that spoke louder than any words. Naomi hesitated, then took a step toward the passenger list clipped near the cockpit door. Her fingers trembled as she scanned the names, hoping to find something that would help Morgan. But before she could say anything, Veronica snapped, "Naomi, what are you doing?" Naomi turned, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was just checking. I've got this under control," Veronica interrupted, her tone sharp. "You don't need to get involved." Naomi stepped back, her face flushing with embarrassment. She bit her lip, torn between doing what she knew was right and the fear of losing her job. As the tension built, a kindly-looking man seated across the aisle leaned forward. The businessman, dressed in a crisp suit and exuding a calm demeanor, smiled at Morgan. "Excuse me," he said gently. "Is everything all right?" And Veronica's frustration boiled over. Her voice shook as she leaned closer to Morgan. "Why don't you just admit you're in the wrong seat and stop wasting everyone's time?" Morgan remained silent, her calmness only fueling Veronica's anger. Veronica finally left Morgan alone and turned to carry out her other duties angrily. Veronica moved briskly down the aisle, her polished shoes clicking softly on the carpet. She carried a tray of sparkling water, her demeanor professional, but her expression tight with irritation. Morgan sat quietly in her seat, her attention focused on the book in her hands. Passengers chatted softly, the atmosphere calm until Veronica's subtle hostility began to surface again. Morgan had been waiting patiently for a drink, watching as Veronica served Mr. and Mrs. Whitman first, then moved to others in the back. Veronica, however, made no effort to acknowledge Morgan. The tray was nearly empty when Morgan finally spoke, her tone gentle. "Excuse me, could I have some water, please?" Veronica paused, glancing at Morgan with a dismissive look. "I'll get to you when I can," she said curtly, walking past without another word. Morgan's calm gaze followed Veronica's retreating figure, but she remained silent. Minutes passed, and Morgan shifted in her seat, trying to find a more comfortable position. She stretched one leg slightly into the aisle, her movement unassuming. Veronica returned, tray in hand, her sharp eyes catching the small adjustment. Instead of asking Morgan to move her leg, Veronica deliberately changed her path. In an instant, Veronica's foot struck Morgan's leg. The tray tilted, and the glasses of water tumbled forward, splashing onto Morgan's lap and the floor. Veronica gasped theatrically, her voice sharp and loud. "Look what you've done! You've caused a mess!" Passengers turned their heads, startled by the commotion. Morgan looked up, startled but composed. Her hands brushed at the water on her trousers. Veronica's voice rose, her tone accusatory. The racial undertone of her statement hung in the air, unmistakable to everyone in earshot. Morgan tilted her head slightly, her calm gaze unwavering. "I've only asked to be treated with the same respect as everyone else," she replied. "And if that's too much to ask, then maybe you're the one who doesn't belong here." The words hung in the air, a quiet yet powerful rebuke. Veronica's face flushed with anger. She stepped closer, her frustration boiling over. Then, in a shocking moment, unable to contain herself, Veronica raised her hand and slapped Morgan across the face. The sound echoed through the cabin like a thunderclap. Gasps rippled through the passengers. The businessman stood halfway, his face a mix of disbelief and anger. Naomi's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. Even the nosy socialite appeared taken aback, her previous smirk replaced by a look of unease. Morgan slowly straightened, her hand resting calmly on her lap. Her expression remained composed, her gaze steady as she looked up at Veronica. The cabin was silent, the tension palpable. Morgan now sat fully upright. Her expression didn't change, but her eyes carried a weight that made Veronica hesitate for the first time. "You just made the worst mistake of your life," Morgan said quietly, her voice calm but cutting through the air like a knife. Veronica's jaw tightened, and her hands clenched at her sides. "You crossed the line," she snapped, her voice rising. "You're the one who's been disruptive since you got on this plane." Morgan didn't flinch. She didn't touch her face or respond in kind. Instead, she straightened her posture, her gaze fixed firmly on Veronica. Her calm demeanor remained intact even in the face of such blatant aggression. "You'll regret that," Morgan said softly, her voice carrying a quiet authority that seemed to fill the entire cabin. Veronica faltered for a moment, her confidence shaken by Morgan's unyielding composure, but she quickly recovered, scoffing loudly. "Regret it?" she sneered. "What are you going to do, call the police?" Morgan didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her silence spoke volumes, and the passengers could feel the shift in power. From the corner of the cabin, Naomi, the younger flight attendant, watched the scene unfold with a mixture of horror and determination. She had been quietly observing Veronica's behavior all day, her discomfort growing with every passing moment. Now she knew she couldn't stay silent any longer. Discreetly, Naomi stepped away from the commotion and pulled out her phone. She dialed a number quickly, her fingers trembling slightly. When the call connected, her voice was hushed but firm. "It's Naomi," she said. "We have a situation on the plane." Naomi returned to her post, her face a mix of worry and determination. Veronica, oblivious to the call, stood with her arms crossed, her anger simmering but her authority waning. Morgan remained seated, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to Veronica's rage. Passengers continued to watch, their eyes darting between Morgan and Veronica, unsure of what would happen next. One of them leaned toward Morgan, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are you okay?" she asked, her concern genuine. Morgan turned to her, offering a small, reassuring smile. "I'm fine," she said softly. The tension in the cabin was thick, the silence broken only by the faint hum of the plane's engines. It was clear the situation was far from over. Morgan remained seated, her posture steady despite the water dripping onto her clothing. She looked at Veronica, her voice calm but firm. "All you had to do was treat me with basic respect. But you failed because of your prejudice. You decided I don't belong here simply because of the color of my skin." Veronica's irritation deepened, Her grip on the tray tightened as she leaned closer, her tone mocking. Respect? Maybe you should earn it first. People like you don't deserve my respect. The blatant racism of the statement shocked even some of the most indifferent passengers. The tension in the cabin escalated. Passengers exchanged glances, some shifting in their seats, unsure of how to react. The unspoken question lingered in the air. How far would this go? At this point, Morgan's anger rose, though her composure remained intact. You shouldn't have said that, she said, her voice sharp but firm. Her words carried an unspoken weight, leaving everyone in the cabin wondering what would happen next. Veronica folded her arms, her anger still simmering. Oh, please, she scoffed. I've been more than patient with you. Maybe now you'll understand that actions have consequences. Morgan's eyes narrowed slightly, her calm demeanor still unbroken. You're right, she said softly, her words deliberate. Actions do have consequences, and you're about to find out just how true that is. For a moment, Veronica faltered. Something in Morgan's tone sent a chill down her spine, but she quickly recovered, her facade of authority returning. Is that a threat? She asked, her voice sharp. No, Morgan replied calmly. It's a promise. Before Veronica could respond, the cabin door opened. A tall, distinguished man in a crisp suit stepped inside, his presence commanding immediate attention. Behind him stood two airline executives, their expressions grave. The man's gaze swept across the cabin before settling on Morgan. His stern expression softened slightly. Ms. Davis, he said, his voice carrying a mix of respect and concern. I apologize for the interruption. Is everything all right? Morgan nodded, her calm demeanor unchanged. I'm fine, James. Thank you for coming. Veronica's confident facade crumbled as she glanced between Morgan and the new arrivals. Who are you? She demanded, though her voice had lost its edge. The revelation hit the cabin like a thunderclap. Passengers gasped, exchanging shocked glances. The businessman who had spoken up earlier couldn't suppress a smile. Naomi, still standing nearby, let out a visible sigh of relief. Veronica's face drained of all color. Owns? She repeated, her voice barely audible. Yes, Morgan said, finally rising from her seat. She stood with quiet dignity, water still staining her white trousers. I acquired Skyline Aviation 6 months ago. Today was my first flight inspection to see how our premium service operates. She glanced around the cabin. I wanted to experience it as a regular passenger would, not as the CEO. Murmurs rippled through the cabin as the truth sank in. The socialite who had sided with Veronica now looked mortified, avoiding eye contact with everyone. I've seen quite enough, Morgan continued, her voice steady. James, please escort Ms. Reed from the aircraft. Her services won't be required for this flight, or any future flights with our company. James nodded, gesturing for Veronica to move toward the exit. The rest of the crew will continue with their duties. We'll have a replacement for Ms. Reed shortly. Veronica stood frozen, the reality of her situation finally dawning on her. Ms. Davis, she began, her voice trembling. I had no idea. That's precisely the problem, Morgan interrupted, her voice firm but not unkind. You shouldn't need to know that I own the airline to treat me with basic human dignity. Every passenger deserves respect, regardless of their appearance, their race, or their perceived status. She turned to address the entire cabin, her presence now undeniably commanding. What happened today is unacceptable, not just to me, but to anyone who has ever been judged, dismissed, or humiliated based on prejudice or assumptions. Morgan's gaze swept across the passengers, some of whom now looked profoundly uncomfortable. Skyline Aviation will be implementing new training protocols effective immediately. We will not tolerate discrimination of any kind on our flights. She turned back to Veronica, who stood pale and defeated. You didn't see a CEO today, Ms. Reed. You saw a black woman in first class and decided she didn't belong. That type of thinking doesn't belong in our company, or anywhere in society. Veronica, finally grasping the magnitude of her actions, allowed herself to be escorted from the cabin, her head bowed in shame. As the door closed behind them, There was a moment of stunned silence, followed by a spontaneous eruption of applause from several passengers. The businessman who had spoken up earlier stood and extended his hand to Morgan.